It's something that has eluded humans for centuries. Where does creativity come from? Is it like being struck with lightning, an idea sent from the heavens? Or is it a process, something to be built upon? People sift through quotations said by so-called creative geniuses like Mozart or J.K. Rowling to learn how to be creative themselves. It's a fascinating thing to study, and something Alan Gannett, the CEO of Track Maven and author of The Creative Curve, set out to investigate.
My day job is giving data and analytics to marketers, and these are supposed to be some of the most creative people, but I would hear all this lack of creative confidence. Like, I'm not creative enough. I'm not Picasso. I'm not Mozart. I'm not Steve Jobs. And I thought this was really fascinating because I had always been a big reader of stories of creativity and histories and all this stuff. And, the stories you read about creativity are not the stories actually of luck or things being easy. They're actually the stories of hard work. And so I started to realize that there's this huge disconnect where creatives, aspiring creatives, we have this notion that creativity is this mystical, magical thing. Like, there's a whole David Brooks column about how inspiration is godlike. And the reality is, that's just not true. We actually have a lot of science. We have a lot of history that shows us that creativity is the result of a lot of hard, thoughtful work.
So in his journey to understand creativity, Gannett sought out the best of the best and interviewed creative professionals.
These are startup people. I interviewed a Michelin star chef. I interviewed novelists, screenwriters, producers. And what I was looking for in particular were people who did it multiple times. Like, that's what I'm really fascinated by, is these people who seemingly can create hit after hit after hit. They aren't just one-hit wonders. There's no chance they just lucked into it. There must be something more at work, and that really fascinates me.
Gannett talked to musicians and writers and producers, but he also explored some of the more overlooked realms of creativity. For instance, he sought out the creative team behind Ben & Jerry's ice cream.
Ben & Jerry's is a fascinating example of creativity. They built this line that's worth billions of dollars, and they do it through every year. They come up with 8 to 10 new flavors, and they're constantly innovating. They're constantly coming out with new things, because otherwise the brand eventually becomes stale. People get bored of it. And so what you see is that these great consumer goods companies are really great examples of creativity. You see this with even things as boring as like detergent companies. Think about, Tide with the Tide pen, or I guess now infamously the Tide Pods. These things have gone on to be massive commercial success, and they involved reimagining the sort of format and platform of something as basic as detergent.
What Gannett says he eventually discovered was that successful creative minds, the people responsible for what he describes as hit after hit, follow an easy-to-define but tough-to-execute recipe.
The big driver of consumer preference, it turns out, is creating things that are at the blend of familiarity and novelty. See, it turns out we have this urge as humans to seek out things that are familiar because they feel safe, but we also like to seek out things that are novel because they represent potential reward. And this seems like a contradiction, but really it's our brain's way of balancing risk and reward. So when you see the best ideas tend to be the ones that are both familiar and novel. Think about the first Star Wars. It was literally a Western in space. It was familiar, but it's novel. Right now, there's those sushi burritos that are taking over, lunch counters and all this stuff, and it's familiar, but it's novel. It's sushi, but in a burrito. And so one of the things I thought was so interesting is that since familiarity is a big part of creativity, I found that these great creatives, the people who are really good at it, they actually spend a huge amount of their time consuming information. We talk about creatives as doing, sort of as the opposite of us consumers who are just consuming culture. They're very active. But actually, the creatives who are really successful, because familiarity is so important, they have to know what their audience has experienced. So they're some of the biggest consumers.
And with this in mind, we can begin to see where some of that work behind being a creative comes into play. It isn't enough to simply have talent. You have to grasp your artistic medium. Deep knowledge of your form also allows a creative to do something else Gannett says is essential in creativity: adapting to change.
The creatives who we think of as the most genius are the ones who very gracefully are able to change their styles to match the style changes of their audience. So the Beatles, I think, are the best example of this, where there's a study I talk about in the book that was done by an empirical musicologist who studies the math of music, and he did this study looking at the Beatles' use of experimental song features. And what's so interesting about the Beatles is that They started as pop, they became experimental, they sort of returned to sort of more basic routes, and they were constantly shifting their style to always be that blend of the familiar and the novel to their audience. They weren't creating the same album twice. There was always a new sound. There was something new that people could get excited about. And in many ways, they helped set the direction for pop music in the 60s. And they were rewarded with that, with this sort of, label now as, creative geniuses. And so I really think that the ability to change and conform to your audience is really, when we talk about creative genius, it's really what we're talking about.
While the hours spent consuming culture are certainly vital, Gannett says hours spent practicing, planning, and editing are also sometimes overlooked. Gannett says no one is simply born a creative genius, not even Mozart.
There's this sort of image of him as a 3-year-old playing the piano for the Pope, because you watch the movie Amadeus, and that's how we picture him. There's the stories about how he would write music without actually having to, edit, or he would have no second drafts. It's all first drafts, and they're always perfect. And Mozart's story is just full of historical embellishments. I mean, the letter that he wrote that described his composition process and described how, he would just compose the music in his head without pen or paper. Well, it actually turns out that was sort of a old school version of, hashtag fake news. It was actually forged by a music magazine publisher in the early 1800s who wanted to sell more magazines. Mozart was not playing the piano at 3 blindfolded for the Pope. What really happened was, when he was 3 years old, his dad was essentially a helicopter dad and hired him the best music teachers in all of Europe and told him that, basically the way to gain his love is become a great musician. And little Mozart proceeded to practice 3 hours every single day with some of the best music teachers in all of Europe. And so we have these notions of creativity that have been told to us by the media or through these long historical games of telephone, and they're nowhere near the truth.
For a more modern example of this phenomenon, Gannett says to look at J.K. Rowling. Many people hold the belief that she wrote Harry Potter on napkins in a fit of creativity. The truth is less romantic, but a lot more inspiring.
There's the famous anecdote of her being on a train and the idea of Harry Potter coming to her and scribbling on a napkin the story. And the truth is that she was on a train. She didn't have a napkin. She came up with the idea for Harry Potter, the character, and some of the other characters. Then she spent 5 years writing the first book. There's one interview she did on TV where she actually shows the interviewer a box full of all the 15 different versions of chapter 1 that she did that went into the first book. So, J.K. Rowling was this very iterative, very long, grinding process, but we talk about her as if she just sort of was one day lucked into this multi-billion-dollar idea.
Ultimately, Gannett says he wanted his book to illuminate this truth behind creativity, that we can all be creative and make great work if we're willing to put in the effort.
Most people, the vast majority of people in culture, feel like they are not creative and they can't be creative and they never could be. And to me, that's the bigger problem, is that I think as a society, we've sort of put up creative geniuses on a pedestal and said, look at them, they're different. You're not them. Look at them, look how special they are. And the reality is that science shows us, no, we all have the same creative potential. Creativity is a learnable, nurturable skill. You can get better at it. And for me, that's the big issue, is I think if something's romanticized to the point that people limit their own lives, that is sort of the much more sad phenomenon to me. I'm perfectly happy ripping down the romantic veneer of creativity.
For more anecdotes and lessons on creativity, Alan Gannett's book, The Creative Curve, is available now. For more information on all of our guests, visit our site, viewpointsonline.net. You can find us on Twitter at Viewpoints Radio. Our show was written and produced by Evan Rook. Studio production by Sean Waldron and Jason Dickey. Reed Pence is our executive producer. I'm Marty Peterson.